Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is John Hall from the Joint History Office, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today on behalf of the OSD History Office. I apologize for the tightness of the room. Clearly, this is a topic that has a lot of contemporary relevance, and so thanks to Dr. David Fields for being with us here today. Dr. Fields earned his PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2017. During the 2016-17 academic year, he was a Fulbright Scholar at Yonsei University in Seoul, South Korea. He is the author of Foreign Friends, Sigmund Rhee, American Exceptionalism, and the Division of Korea, which the University of Kentucky Press published this year. He is the editor of the Diary of Sigmund Rhee, published by the Museum of Contemporary Korean History, and the book review editor of the Journal of American East Asian Relations. He has been published in the Washington Post, the North Korea Review, the Journal of America East Asian Relations, SinoNK.com, Transactions of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea Branch, and in the working paper series of the Cold War International History Project. I can also add to his official bio that he is currently the Associate Director of the Center for East Asia Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a fiercely competitive squash player. He has had the audacity to peek behind the veil of Potemkin villages in North Korea and live to tell about it. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Fields.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for coming out. I was telling some people before that twice this summer I lectured to an audience of 6. So it is really nice to have a full room of interested people. And I love lecturing to military and defense-related audiences because generally they're interested in this topic as if it might affect them in some way in the future, which is something that I often don't get when I just lecture to academic audiences. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to tell you the story of the pre-1945 origins of the division of Korea and why it still matters. So this is a very complicated story. It's so complicated, in fact, as John said, I've written a whole book about it. So what I'm going to do today is we don't have time to go into the whole book, the whole story of the division of Korea, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of what I think are the most important elements. And if you're interested, please consider buying the book and getting the whole story. So we have 3 key points that I think you need to understand the pre-1945 origins of the division of Korea. The first one is the 1882 Korean-American Treaty. The second one is the growth of Christianity in Korea, the explosive growth of Christianity in Korea. And then the third is how independence activists, both Koreans and Americans, use these 2 things to lobby in the United States. Okay? So 1882 Treaty, explosive growth of Christianity, and Americans and Korean lobbying about these 2 things. If you can understand these 3 points, I think you're well on your way to understanding the pre-45 origins of the division of Korea. So U.S. relations with Korea, or rather the Kingdom of Chosun as it was then called, began in 1882 when they established diplomatic relations via the 1882 Korean-American Treaty. Article 1 of that treaty stated, if other powers deal unjustly or oppressively with either government, the other will exert their good offices on being informed of the case to bring about an amicable arrangement, thus showing their friendly feelings. Okay. Now, only a lawyer could write something so obtuse. All right? So what does that actually mean? So at this point, good offices is a technical legal term which refers to mediation. So if either of the 2 parties get into trouble with another country and they request the mediation of the United States, that it's both parties request it, the United States is obligated then to offer its mediation, all right? Nothing more. Now, the problem was there was no term in Korean or in East Asian legal jurisprudence for good offices. So when this text was translated into Korean, it simply read, must help, okay? The United States must help if Korea got into some difficulties with its neighbors at some point in the future. This was not an alliance between Korea and the Kingdom of Chosun, but the Kingdom of Chosun, for several reasons, decided to represent it as one, even though they were receiving counter advice from the State Department telling them this was not an alliance. They chose to try to put most of their eggs in that basket, and there are some complex reasons why they did that. All right, but so they tried to view it as alliance. They tried to tell their people that they had an alliance with the United States. So what happens in 1905? All right, in 1905, Japan and Russia go to war over Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. And the Japanese forces used Korea as a staging ground. They asked the Kingdom of Chosun for permission. They said, we just need to transit through Korea to fight the Russians. We'll leave when they're done. We'll leave when we're done. I think the Kingdom of Chosun was very skeptical about this, but they figured it was probably an offer they could not refuse. So the Japanese forces came up through Korea, and then after the war refused to leave and began the 5-year process of turning Korea into a Japanese colony. Now, during that process, the Kingdom of Chosun was sending envoys to the United States, diplomatic envoys, asking them to help restore Korea's independence, or actually help maintain Korea's independence, because the Japanese had said, we will guarantee your independence and we will leave after the war, and they had not done that. So one of these envoys was this young man named Sigmund Rhee, who you may know of as the first president of the Republic of Korea. Okay, he had a very, very long career, and while he's in his early 30s in 1904, he is dispatched to the United States as an envoy of the Kingdom of Chosun, trying to meet with American government officials to ask them to abide by their Article I obligations in the 1882 Korean-American Treaty. Now, against very long odds, Rhee actually succeeds in getting an audience with Roosevelt at his summer home in 1905 as he is negotiating the Portsmouth Treaty. And Rhee asks for the United States to intervene in the situation according to the Korean understanding of the treaty. And Roosevelt says, I'm very sympathetic to your argument. Yes, I agree that we have obligations. The problem is you don't have quite the right credentials as a diplomat, okay? So I can't do anything with your request, but if you will just route it through the Korean embassy in Washington, then we can do something about this. Now, what Roosevelt knew at the time was that the Korean embassy in Washington had already been bought out by the Japanese, and that that request was not going to go through. But he rejected the Korean request based on a very narrow technical diplomatic question, all right? Now, what he would do later in 1912 is justify his failure to act, not based on any technicalities, but because, quote, it was out of the question to suppose that any other nation with no interest of its own at stake would attempt to do for the Koreans what they were utterly unable to do for themselves, okay? So rather than a technical reason, he was saying, it just doesn't make sense for us to do that. The Koreans are not fit for self-government, and in fact, Roosevelt had already decided to support the Japanese colonization of Korea. He believed that Korea was going to be a source of instability in the Far East between China, Russia, and Japan, and that it was better to have the Japanese in control of the Korean Peninsula. All right? Now, this action by Roosevelt made no news whatsoever in 1905. There were very few Americans at all who cared about Korea in 1905, and those who knew something about Korea generally favored Roosevelt's idea that the Koreans are not fit for self-government and that it's better to have Japan colonize Korea. Well, this begins to change in 1907, because in 1907, the Great Pyongyang Revival breaks out, which is one of the great Christian revivals of the 20th century. And Korea goes from being a backwater of a mission field for American Christian missionaries. They'd been there about 30 years by that time and had maybe produced between 3,000 and 5,000 converts. It goes from being a backwater to have Korean Christians growing exponentially, okay, in a very short period of time. And Korea very quickly becomes the most successful field for Christian missionaries in East Asia. And for the first time, it looks like it's possible that American missionaries can turn an East Asian country into a majority Christian nation. Now, Sigmund Rhee stays in the United States during this time, and through the support of returned missionaries, gets his degree at GW in Washington, goes on to get an MA at Harvard and a PhD in Princeton, okay? And he is very well placed to become the spokesman of this new Korean Christianity, of which Americans are intensely interested in. So between 1905 and 1910, Rhee records in his diary giving 184 lectures on Korean Christianity in churches and civic organizations all around the United States. And he's well placed. He is a convert to Christianity himself by American missionaries, so he's well placed to explain to these American audiences what's going on. And he encourages them to invest more resources and to send more missionaries to Korea. And he does this because Rhee believes that Korean Christianity is incompatible with Japanese colonialism, and that sooner or later the two will come to a conflict. So what he's doing is he's creating a base of support for what he hopes will be a Korean independence movement when it breaks out. Rhee rarely talks about politics during this period because he understands that most Americans don't care at all about Korea politically. All they care about is what's happening religiously there. And those that know something about Korea politically are more favorable to the Japanese position. So he undertakes about 10 years of lobbying very subtly to grow connections between Americans and Korean Christians, and really becomes the spokesperson for this new Korean Christianity in the United States. Well, the conflict that he was hoping and that he foresaw actually comes to fruition in 1 March 1919, which is known as the March 1st movement in Korea. And what happens in this movement is the great powers are meeting at Versailles, right, to try to adjust all sorts of problems, one of them going to be self-determination of colonized peoples around the world. Now, it seems quite likely that Woodrow Wilson was not at all interested in colonized peoples, especially in East Asia, but that did not prevent the Koreans from hoping that they could get on the agenda, especially since Sigmund Rhee, in fact, had a personal relationship with Woodrow Wilson. He was a friend of Wilson's family when they were at Princeton. And so what Koreans in the independence movement in Korea decide to do is on March 1st, they're going to have a nationwide nonviolent protest in which they go out in the streets and demand their independence from Japan. Now, they're under no illusion that the Japanese are actually going to give them independence, but what they're hoping to do is create a backlash that will be so violent and that will be so drastic that the leaders meeting in Versailles will not be able to ignore it. And that's in fact what happens. On March 1st, Koreans across the country go out. If you see a Japanese flag, you'll realize it's very easily, with some blue and black paint, turned into a Korean flag. So that's what they do. They take the Japanese flags, they paint on the teguki, and they go waving down the street yelling "Manse" or "May Korea live 10,000 years." Okay? And what the Japanese do is they overreact. They slaughter 7,000 civilians within the first few weeks. They torture and imprison many tens of thousands more over the subsequent weeks. And thanks to the connections between Korean Christians and American missionaries, word of this eventually filters back to the United States, okay? And this image right here is from a newspaper article. American missionaries, many of them were medical missionaries. They're treating these kinds of Koreans that have these wounds. They're taking pictures and they're sending it back to the United States. And American Christians are outraged about this. And the narrative is that the Japanese are attempting to squash and to eliminate Korean Christianity. The missionaries still do not want to get political, but their catchphrase is, there can be no neutrality on brutality, okay? As a part of this movement, the Koreans also create for the first time a Korean provisional government, a government in exile, and they elect Sigmund Rhee to be president of that government. So after 1919, Rhee becomes both the spokesman for Korean Christianity and the spokesman for the Korean independence movement. And he uses these connections between Korean and American Christians to do more intense lobbying in the United States. So between 1919 and 1922, over 8,000 newspaper articles are published in the United States on Korea and the Korean independence movement. And I've yet to see one that does not take the Korean side. The Presbyterian national publication, The Interior, wrote in 1919, quote, "The future course of Christian enlightenment in the Far East is at stake. Korea has virtually forced the hand of the civilized world, and we must decide what we are going to do about it." During this period, dozens of Korean independence activists go on the Chautauqua circuit. And if you don't know what the Chautauqua circuit is, it's like TED Talks before radio. And it specializes in reaching rural communities. So Chautauqua Association would put together a slate of speakers. They would tour around the rural Midwest. They would set up a tent. You would pay your 5 cents and go in and hear a lecture about something. Now, these Chautauquas had to earn revenue. So you didn't put speakers on the Chautauqua that you did not think were going to draw in an audience. And you didn't choose topics that you didn't think were going to draw in an audience. And my research indicates that in this period, over 200,000 Americans in the Midwest heard a Chautauqua lecture on Korea, Korean Christianity, and the Japanese suppression of it. It was a very, very successful movement. Okay. They also established a grassroots lobbying organization called the League of Friends of Korea. And by 1922, this league had over 25,000 members in 14 branches across the United States. And these branches were almost all headed by a local Methodist, Presbyterian, or Baptist minister. And if you know something about American religious history at this time, if you have the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists on your side, you've covered a large segment of the American population. Part of the founding documents, I do not know where that sound is coming from.
You're so popular, there's an overflow room.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
Apparently they're like
Okay, wonderful. All right. I just want to read just a couple of lines from the founding charter of the League of Friends of Korea. We, the Friends of Korea, believe that in the principle of equal right to live and develop in freedom for the weak and strong nations alike. This should be upheld by the United States as we fought for that purpose in World War I. As Christians, we feel it our moral duty to inject ourselves into this issue for reasons of Christianity and humanity. The American public must make its voice manifest on the great principles involved, for failing to do so would be to shirk our duties. Now, Korea becomes such an emotive issue during this period that it actually gets injected into the debate over the Versailles Treaty in the United States. And this is one of the most shocking things I think that I found during my research, is that senators were debating this treaty issue, all right? And for reasons that are complicated that I'm not going to go into now, but the Koreans actually strike an alliance with the irreconcilable portion of the U.S. Senate. These were the 14 senators who were opposed to the Versailles Treaty on any terms whatsoever. And they do that because their reading of the Versailles Treaty, they think, would lock Korea forever into the Japanese sphere of influence as a colony of Japan. So they oppose the treaty. And what it gets for these senators, these 14 senators, is it gives them a way to rebut the charge that they're isolationists, okay? Because they say we're not isolationists, we're nationalists. The United States needs to be able to pursue an independent policy so it can address things like the issue of Korea right now. Oh, I should say, I skipped over something. One of the main ways the Koreans lobby at this time is by going around and reminding, or actually informing Americans for the first time about the 1882 Korean-American Treaty. If you remember, one of the causes that the United States goes to war for in World War I is the violation of Belgian neutrality, right? And so the catchphrase is, Germany is guilty of regarding treaties as mere scraps of paper. So Sigmund Rhee and his surrogates are going around the United States speaking in churches and telling American Christians, oh, by the way, the Germans aren't the only people guilty of regarding treaties as mere scraps of paper. You've done this yourself. You had an alliance with Korea, and you violated it. All right? Now, that was not technically true. That was a very self-serving narrative, but nevertheless, it was the narrative that Sigmund Rhee used, and these issues were so obscure, there were very few people who were going to come out and correct him on that. So what happens is this gets injected into the debate over the Versailles Treaty, and you have someone like Senator George Norris say, I wish all the Christian people of America would note that all the sacrifices which they made in Korea, now if this treaty goes through, and all that they have made in China, or every missionary that has gone there to set up a church and preach the doctrine of Christianity, are all in jeopardy. Just two others. Joseph France, we cannot sign this treaty, that's the Versailles Treaty, without an utter disregard for our moral and treaty obligations, referring to the 1882 treaty, towards the Korean people. Senator William Borah, having made the treaty, the 1882 treaty, which we made, I think we are under obligations to exercise our friendly offices in preventing the amalgamation or the incorporation of Korea with Japan. Korea becomes a debate in the fight over the Versailles Treaty. And in March of 1920, a reservation to the treaty will be proposed obligating the United States to recognize Korea's independence. And this reservation falls just 7 votes short of passing in the US Senate, okay? Obviously, it would have made no difference in the end because the Versailles Treaty is not ratified, but it's important to gauge just how important and emotive this issue had become. All right, so the effects of this lobbying period from 1919 to 1922 was that Korean and American lobbyists essentially flip American public opinion about Korea. Okay, between 1919 and 1922, they win the battle for hearts and minds. There's no one who's willing to stand up during the debate over the Versailles Treaty when they're discussing Korea. There's no one who's willing to take the Rooseveltian position anymore, okay, and say that the Koreans got what they deserved. They're not a civilized people, because now, because of the Great Revival, many people actually think that the Koreans are more civilized than the Japanese, okay? So the Koreans win the battle for hearts and minds, but they cannot change United States policy. The United States is not interested in confronting the Japanese over Korea. They don't have the will to do it. They do not have the ability to project hard power in that region, all right? So I think at the end of this period, the position is best stated by journalist, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Cyril Player, who wrote that, quote, "Everyone knows Korea has a case. The American people are by no means unsympathetic towards the Koreans. If there is apathy, it is the apathy of regret, tinged with weariness and impregnated by a miserable feeling of impotence to put matters right." All right, so the Koreans stay active during this entire period, but for the sake of time, we're going to skip to the late 1930s, all right? Okay, so we've gone over the treaty, the growth of Christianity. We're halfway through how Korean independence activists use these things. So the movement stays active. But in the late 1930s, after the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, after the bombing of Shanghai, Sigmund Rhee begins to think that the United States and Japan are on a collision course. And he spends 1939, 1940, and 1941 writing a truly amazing book called Japan Inside Out. And in this book, Sigmund Rhee essentially blames the United States for everything that has happened in East Asia up to that time. Okay, and he says, if you had confronted the Japanese in Korea in 1904, none of this ever would have happened, okay? If you had stood up to the Japanese in 1933, none of this ever would have happened. If you would have just abided by your treaty obligations, we would be in an entirely different situation today. And by the way, don't think that the Japanese aren't coming for you eventually, okay? You cannot appease them. Sooner or later, they're going to attack you. And then he did something else that I feel like was incredibly astute, and that is he hit right at the core of American exceptionalism and American identity and said, and by the way, you're nowhere near the generation that your grandparents were, okay? You are not the generation that sent American missionaries to Korea. You are not the founding generation. You have abandoned the spirit of 1776, which recognized that the liberty that you enjoy has to be supported elsewhere, okay? He goes right to the heart of American identity. This book is published in July of 1941. It goes through another printing in October of 1941. It's reviewed by Pearl Buck and other East Asia experts. And when Pearl Harbor happens on 7 December 1941, Rhee is transformed almost immediately into something of a spurned prophet. Okay, the long-suffering Korean who had seen this coming for decades, who had tried to warn the United States, and nobody listened. So after Pearl Harbor, Rhee goes back on the lecture circuit, hits it very hard, and he has a speech at GW which he begins this way. I do not wish to say in any recriminatory way that we Koreans, the first victims of Japan's insane march of conquest, told you so, but we did. This is how he begins his lectures around the United States, saying that because you didn't abide by your treaty obligations, because you didn't act morally, because you didn't listen to us, now you have got your comeuppance. And what are you going to do about it? Rhee, while he's touring, is encouraging a concrete policy goal. He wants the United States to recognize the Korean Provisional Government, which is still in existence and which he is the de facto foreign minister of. And what he tells American people, not only does he keep talking about Christianity, keep talking about the 1882 treaty, but he says recognizing the Korean Provisional Government will provide 22 million new allies in the fight against Japan. And he tells American parents who are sending their sons to fight and die in the Pacific, why are you sending your sons? When if you will just give the Korean Provisional Government the aid it needs, we will fight the Japanese for you. We will do the job for you if you give us the weapons. All right. This was patently untrue. There's only 22 million Koreans in the entire world at this time, most of them on the Korean Peninsula. There's absolutely no way to get weapons to them. There are small groups of Koreans in Siberia and China that could have been supported. But what Rhee and what the United States government both know is that the Korean Provisional Government is just one of many Korean groups that is vying to be the future Korean government. Now, the KPG was definitely the strongest claim to legitimacy, but they know that there was a group of Soviet Koreans that were being groomed by the Soviet Union. And they also know that Chiang Kai-shek has imposed a series of humiliating agreements on the Korean Provisional Government, essentially aimed at restoring China's position, that's nationalist China's position in Korea after the war. And so they worry two things, that recognizing the KPG will actually be surrendering Korea to Chiang Kai-shek in the future, and two, recognizing the KPG will result in the Soviets upping their effort, in the nationalists in China upping their effort, and they're worried about starting a war for Korea before the war for Japan is even won. So the United States refuses to recognize the KPG, but the State Department nor the War Department can say why explicitly, because you can't say why without bringing up all this inter-allied conflict that's going on, which you don't want being aired while you're in the middle of a war against Japan. All right? Rhee understands this very well, but he has a single-minded goal. And so instead of being cooperative, he goes right to the American people and tells them, something doesn't smell right here. Why is the United States government refusing our offer of 22 million allies in the war against Japan? Why didn't they abide by their treaty obligations in the first place? Why were they so unprepared for Pearl Harbor? And he begins to feed this sense of paranoia and skepticism towards the government that many American people are also harboring. All right? And at this time, he continues to work the lobbying lines, to continue to work with and American Christians. Can I have the next slide? Oh, I'm sorry. Next slide of the, oh, never mind. He refounds a grassroots organization called the Christian Friends of Korea, which is headed by Peter Marshall, who is essentially the Joey Osteen of his time, or the Rick Warren, a major celebrity pastor. He founds an organization called the Christian Friends of Korea, which is headed by Bing Crosby, maybe the most famous singer of the time, and he becomes something of a minor American celebrity. He gets to meet with people like Wendell Willkie, Fiorello LaGuardia, Albert Einstein. He's invited to the White House to meet Eleanor Roosevelt, who then writes about him twice in her nationally syndicated My Day column, where she highlights the 1882 Korean-American Treaty. And he loves these articles, and he quotes them over and over again, saying, see, even the First Lady in the White House recognizes that you are under an obligation towards Korea. But he can't get any satisfaction over this KPG issue. He cannot get the United States to recognize the KPG. So what he does in the spring of 1945, after Roosevelt has passed away, is he goes public with a sensational accusation that Roosevelt and Stalin made a secret agreement at Yalta trading Korea to the Soviet Union in return for an early Soviet entry into the war against Japan. And as you can see, this allegation is front page news around the United States, okay? This is the Chicago Times. This is the New York Times, all right? There is no historical evidence that this happened at all. As a matter of fact, I am quite confident that it didn't happen, but nobody knew that at the time. And reportedly, even Truman sent some of his aides to dig through the records of these conferences to try to find out if it was true. There were many things that FDR did that people did not have the complete details on. I should say, too, that to this day, I know very few Korean scholars who do not believe that this happened, who do not believe that there was a deal at Yalta in which Korea was traded for the Soviet Union. And what Rhee's sensational allegations do is they set off really a series of moral outrage in the United States among these Christian groups, both Protestant and Catholics, who began pressuring their congressmen to do something about Korea. And I'll just read you one letter from one Latia B. McLeans, who wrote to Truman during the summer of 1945, saying that American Christians were much concerned to hear that Christian Korea had been traded to Russia. She was praying that Truman would receive divine guidance, and that heeding this guidance, the United States of America will shine again as a great Christian nation. Another American Presbyterian leader, William LaRoe, wrote to Truman and warned him of what a row he will have with the church people if Korea is abandoned to the Soviet Union. Okay, next slide, please. So in June and July and August of 1945, under the pressure of these lobbying organizations, you have congressmen like Representative Schaffer of Michigan saying, are we for a second time this century going to betray the Korean people? Are we going to forsake them and shatter their dreams of democracy? Are we going to sell them down the river to communism? All right. Others, such as William Langer, say on the Senate floor, they actually buy Rhee's line and say, if it was not for our disregard of the 1882 Korean-American Treaty, we would not be in this situation in the first place. And what can we expect from the future if we keep repeating the mistakes of the past? Next slide, please. William Morse actually says that the United States was first guilty of appeasing the Japanese, and now we are making the mistake of appeasing the Soviets over Korea. He gives an absolutely wonderful speech in late July of 1945 that was actually written for him by Rhee's ghostwriter, a speechwriter from Penn State named Robert T. Oliver. So there's all of this outrage as the war is ending, that something must be done for Korea, that Korea cannot be abandoned a second time. But of course, there's a real big problem, right? At the end of the war, Soviet troops are already marching into Korea, while the nearest United States troops are over 6 weeks away. There's no way that the United States can prevent the Soviets from getting there first. And there's a disagreement between the State Department and the War Department over what to do. The War Department wants none of Korea. They can't get there in time. Korea is indefensible. They have no plan for the occupation of Korea. The State Department says, we need to do something about Korea. We cannot abandon Korea at this point without severe political costs. And so the 38th parallel idea comes up, not as a compromise between the Americans and the Soviets. It's a compromise between the State Department and the War Department, all right? It's a compromise between political civilian leaders under great pressure and American military leaders saying, this is not what we want, all right? Now, they suggest this idea to the Soviets of the 38th parallel, which is much further up the Korean Peninsula than halfway and includes the capital of Seoul. And I think that there's a part of them that is really hoping that the Soviets are going to turn them down. Because if the Soviets turn them down, then they can wash their hands of Korea and say, we tried, but the facts on the ground were just not going to work out for us. There's nothing that we could do for Korea. Well, of course, as you all know, the Soviets don't turn it down. They don't quibble with it at all. They say yes. And when they say yes, the United States military is left to undertake an occupation of Korea that they have no plans for whatsoever. In fact, it's so bad that when General Hodge shows up, he's literally unsure if he's liberating an occupied territory or if he's occupying enemy territory, because the only directives that he has are the directives that were sent for the occupation of Japan, which mention Korea only in one line, and they say a military government will be established in Korea as needed. That is the extent of his instructions while he goes to Korea. All right, so why does this matter? Why does all this matter today? Of course, Korea is still divided. It's a problem that we have to deal with no matter what. Okay, so why do these pre-1945 origins matter? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I should make one more point. The U.S. Army, as soon as it gets there, realizes this is a terrible situation, and they want to liquidate that commitment as quickly as possible. Matter of fact, the State Department's political officer, Benninghoff and Hodge, both by October, they get there in September, by October are saying, we should leave Korea as soon as possible, okay? The Koreans are determined to have their independence, and they may fight us for it. They may fight us and the Soviets at the same time. So the United States Army is looking to liquidate its commitment to Korea as soon as possible. And it's kind of a long story, the next 4 years, but it's very important to acknowledge that they do liquidate this commitment to Korea in 1949. U.S. troops are withdrawn from Korea in July of 1949. A handful of advisors are left there, but almost all American forces are withdrawn over the strenuous objections of the Korean government, now led by Sigmund Rhee, who says essentially, you can't leave now. You know, you have divided this place. We are vulnerable. If you leave now, I think that there's a good chance that we're going to be invaded by the North. And in an attempt to liquidate a small commitment, the United States actually ends up facilitating a much greater commitment when, of course, the North Koreans invade in June, and prior to everyone's expectations, the United States does get involved. All right, so next slide, please. So why does all this matter? All right, as I was saying before, Korea is divided today. All right, does it really matter? I think it does. And the reason it matters so much is it shapes Korean views. This history shapes Korean views of the United States and the US-ROK alliance. I think too many Americans, and hopefully not people in this room, but I think too many Americans view the US-Korea relationship as starting in June 1925, 1950, when the American cavalry rides in to save South Korea from the communists. And we've been there ever since, right? And we spend a lot of money basing troops in Korea. We have a lot of people over there. And if you look at the relationship from June of 1950 on, you could come to the conclusion that really, what's in this for the United States? The Koreans seem to be getting the better end of this relationship. But that is not at all the way Koreans see the history of US-ROK relations, okay? US-Korean relations. They see the history as starting in 1882 and moving forward. And if you look at that from that perspective, the relationship is very, very different, okay? The United States has not always been a reliable ally. Matter of fact, the United States is in some ways an accomplice in what are the great tragedies of the 20th century for the Koreans, right? An enabler of the occupation of Japan. The division of Korea was never supposed to be permanent at all, but there's no question whose idea it was. It wasn't a Soviet idea. It wasn't a Korean idea. It was an American idea, okay? And then you have the withdrawal of 1949, which facilitated the start of the Korean War. So when you view the relationship from 1882 to 1949, from 1882 to the present, you can see how the Koreans would have a very different characterization of this relationship than the United States does. And while calling Koreans free riders on American security is deeply, deeply offensive, right? And demanding that they pay 5 times as much in cost sharing for American basing there is deeply offensive. And it feeds latent anti-Americanism in Korean society, okay? Like we saw in 2002 after the Yeongju Highway incident, all right? Like we saw in 2008 after the beef wars, okay? Like happened on a small scale this past October when a number of Korean students invaded the ambassador's house over this cost-sharing issue, okay? There's a latent anti-Americanism in South Korean society that is fed by this history, all right? And it also, and I'll say, it really changes Korean views of North Korea. All right, as you may know, only 16% of South Koreans view North Koreans as the enemy. That's according to a 2018 survey. And that is twice the number of Koreans who viewed North Korea as the enemy a decade ago. Okay? So, and the reason, it's very complicated, their relationship between North and South, but one of the reasons that they don't necessarily view the North as an enemy is they view that entire state as a result of the division of Korea, which was not their idea, which was not a Korean idea. So the existence of North Korea from the perspective of the South is more seen as a tragedy, and it was a tragedy largely perpetuated by foreigners. And they acknowledge that it's a threat to them, but it makes their feelings about the North very different. That and a very strong dose of ethno-nationalism. All right, can I have the next slide, please? So I'll just close with a few vignettes about how the 1882 treaty is still very, very much alive and well today. So this is Senate Resolution 279, which was passed in I believe it was passed in 2011. It was authored by Jim Webb and Dick Lugar, among others. And what this resolution called for was the recognition of the 125th anniversary of U.S. relations with the Korean Peninsula. And it was worded in such a way to make you think that the alliance between Korea and the United States had lasted for 125 years. And it was worded in such a way that it appears that the 1882 treaty was actually an alliance between Korea and the United States, okay? I reached out actually to Jim Webb and Dick Lugar to find out how this resolution was drafted and who was involved in it, and I have never heard any answers from either them or their staff. But my sense is there was probably some lobbying going on to get some sort of underhanded recognition of this treaty. And I should say that there was no media about this whatsoever in the United States. Well, this was covered by all the major Korean media outlets in Korea at the time. Finally, in 2014, just before Shinzo Abe made his speech to a joint session of Congress, the Korean cable news channel YTN ran a 90-second micro-documentary on U.S.-Korean relations in which they referred to the cherry trees in the tidal basin out here, just a little ways from here, as gifts from Japan to the United States to President Taft for his role in the Taft-Katsura Memorandum in selling out Korea to the Japanese. And the end of that video shows a cherry blossom falling from that tree and into the hands of one of the bronze comfort women statues that sit outside Japanese embassies all around the world, okay? These pre-1945 origins of the division of Korea are almost completely unknown and forgotten in the United States, but they're very much alive and well today, and it's coverage like this that makes sure that this treaty does not remain just a mere scrap of paper. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fields. We have time for some questions. Do we have a microphone or not? David, feel free to call out your own.
Two questions, if you don't mind.
Yes.
How much is the ethno-nationalism related to family ties that happened when the Korea was split? And secondly is, I think it's related to it, as more time passes, is the ethno-nationalism with North and South Korea declining as the identity and the tech difference and the isolation between the two as more time passes? Thank you.
Yeah, those are excellent questions. Where are you from? In the United States?
Oh, Illinois.
Illinois. Okay. The reason I ask is because here's how I like to explain the Korean division to American audiences. Okay. Imagine tomorrow that someone draws a line right down the middle of Illinois. Okay. And you're from Rockford. You have family in Chicago. Okay. And all of a sudden tomorrow you can have no communication with them at all. You can't write letters. You can't talk to them on the telephone. You can't visit them. They can't visit you, okay? At the end of the day, you're still Illinoisans. You still root for the Chicago Bears. You still eat whatever they eat in Illinois. You still, I'm from Wisconsin, so this works better when I use Wisconsin as an example because I can talk about cheese. But whatever they eat in Illinois, so you still have this great cultural affinity, right? But all of a sudden now you're completely separated. Just let that sink in, for 5 seconds. Just think about never seeing your parents ever again. If you have children across that line, never seeing your children ever again. Never having any contact with them. You just think about how terrible and how disruptive and how awful that would be. And then imagine that goes on for 70 years. So absolutely. Those family ties really color the way South Koreans view North Korean. But you're also exactly correct that as more and more generations pass, there's fewer people who have those first-person ties, right? I mean, all South Koreans have relatives in the North, but a greatly fewer portion of them have ever seen those relatives or have ever had any contact with them. So I think as the generations go by, yes, it becomes less of an emotive issue, and more than the family ties, the focus is on the cost of Korean unification, which is going to be horrific. And this is very much in people's thoughts right now because of the 30th anniversary of the reunification of Germany. And the ongoing costs from that are still in existence. You know, they're still an issue. And West Germany and East Germany were much, much closer together economically and culturally than North and South Korea are today. And one thing I like to highlight is the economic costs of reunification are often highlighted, but actually the ideological work that is going to be required for unification is a challenge that literally no one knows how to deal with. Okay, they have diverged so dramatically ideologically, and I don't think that there's any possibility of re-education, of conversion, whatever you want to call it. It's going to take generations to deconstruct the epistemological structure that that regime has built in the minds of nearly every North Korean. So, yeah.
A question about two of your points, the growth of Christianity and the independence activists. Given the influence of these two factors, how come they weren't great enough to overcome the arbitrary division? Why didn't they bear greater sway in the North?
That's an excellent question. And there's no one who is more tortured by this question than Sigmund Rhee in 1945 and 1946, while he's on the Korean Peninsula, and he's trying to decide whether he's going to fight the United States or whether he's going to ally with the United States. Now, if you know, Rhee is brought back by Hodge, hoping that he's going to be the miracle man that's going to head up the occupation and is going to make things go well because they're not going well. And instead, what Rhee does 5 minutes after getting off the plane is hold a press conference saying this Yalta stuff. Why did you guys do this? And how are you going to fix this? And actually, Hodge says at some point that he wished that Rhee could be gracefully retired from the scene, all right? Which, if that would have happened on north of the border, would mean he would have been shot. You never would have seen him again, okay? So Rhee is trying to decide, can we pull together and fight the Soviets and the Americans? In fact, he writes his American supporters and said, you know what, sometimes I think it would be better if there were no Americans here at all, because then we would have only one enemy, and we could unite against the Soviets and try to throw them out. And that's what he would have done, except the United States wouldn't let him do that, because we are committed to a policy of trusteeship. We're committed to a policy of accommodation with the Soviet Union, even though we know it's not going to work pretty early. But we want to play this game about who's ultimately going to be blamed for it. And we hope that the Soviets can be blamed for it at the end. So we want trusteeship to break down because of things that they did, not because of things that we did. So Rhee is adamant from the time he gets there that he wants to fight, and he wished that the Americans would have supported him right away and tried to reunite the Korean Peninsula. But the United States is not going to do that. So he's stuck between the Soviets and the United States, and then Koreans who are divided on this issue, right? I think there's no doubt that he is definitely the most legitimate and the most popular figure in post-war Korea. But there are Korean communists, right, who believe that communism is the future of Korea. And Rhee is convinced that they're very, very few in number, but the United States is not. And at any rate, they're not going to support this action by him because of what would mean for their relations to the Soviets. So ultimately, what he has to decide to do is to throw his lot in with the United States and the UN to create an independent South Korea. And his argument goes, there's no way that this is going to be resolved as long as there's no Koreans governing themselves. Once Koreans are governing themselves, perhaps there's a way that we can work this out. But really, Rhee ends his life thinking that he is a failure, and that all of his work, he ends up being a very bitter person, saying that I've tried my whole life to just create an independent and unified Korea, and I have not been able to do that. And he's very frustrated with the United States for both the circumstances that led to the division, and then also for really holding him back very early when he wanted to try to go and reunify the peninsula. Good question.
In your next book, are you going to address the Chinese influence during the Korean War, and what does that do in today's thinking about China and North Korea?
I am not currently planning on doing that. My second book will be a history of Rhee's presidency. So this book ends immediately in 1945. This book is the story of the division of Korea. My next book will look at really Rhee and U.S.-Korean relations 1945 to 1965. But I have a feeling you're going somewhere with that question.
I want to know what the future is
You,
from someone who studied it so well.
well, I cannot tell you the future, but I can tell you how unnerving it is right now to hear my Korean friends. And because of what I study, I have way more Korean friends on the right than I do on the left. And by the way, left and right in Korea means nothing that left and right means here. Left and right on Korea basically means, what's your stance on North Korea? Do you want to be tough on North Korea, or do you want to try to accommodate them? Okay? Do you want to support a sanction regime, or do you want to support the Sunshine Policy? That is largely the right and left divide in Korea. And also, how do you feel about the United States? If you're on the right, you value the US-Korean alliance a great deal. If you're on the left, it's not that you want to get rid of it, but you're skeptical about it, okay? And it's very unnerving to hear my Korean friends on the right talk about South Korea developing an indigenous nuclear weapons program, because they are worried about the United States, right? And they are worried that the United States is not a reliable ally. And you have nuclear weapons to the north of them, you have nuclear weapons in China. They are convinced that the Japanese are going to develop nuclear weapons when they get a chance. And so why not get a head start on everyone? Okay? It's also incredibly disheartening for me in the last few years to see how polarized Korean society has become. Okay? It's become almost as polarized as our society, you know, where people on the right don't just disagree with Moon Jae-in, they think he's a traitor. And people on the left don't view people on the right as people who occasionally make bad decisions, but as people who would sell out the Korean nation if they could. Okay, this is a very scary, scary development. I think the US-ROK alliance is still quite strong, but I think we can see the cracks in it, you know? And these cracks could be things that develop much quicker than anybody ever thought, or hopefully they can be patched and they can be adjusted over time. But yeah, you can see things as possibilities now that were impossible in 2014, okay, that were impossible in 2013. And that's troubling.
I'm very interested in, it's a great talk, and I'm
Thank
very
you.
interested in what accounted for this dramatic increase in the conversion to Christianity over such a short period of time. How did that, what prompted that? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So this is controversial as to exactly what caused it. There's a few different theories out there. I think that the best theory is that from a very early point, Korean Christianity got wedded with Korean nationalism, okay? And becoming a Christian was a way that you could resist the Japanese surreptitiously. The Japanese, of course, are trying to impose Shintoism on Korea, and by becoming a Korean Christian, you could resist that, and you could also have connections with the broader world, okay? Sigmund Rhee in his own conversion story is very interesting, and I think he invented this. I don't really think he said this at the time, but this is the way he recorded it. He's in prison, and he cried out, "Oh God, save my soul and save my country." And I think that's the way many Korean Christians saw what they're doing. To become Christian was to resist Japanese colonization, and it was also part of reforming the Korean state. It was seen as a more modern religion. Okay, Sigmund Rhee writes a wonderful book called The Spirit of Independence, and in the epilogue to that book in 1904, he calls for the mass conversion of Koreans to Christianity. Okay, now I don't think that book actually had any influence. Actually, the book wasn't published in Korea until 1911, but I think Rhee was articulating what many Koreans thought, and that is that the kingdom of Chosun has fallen into a decrepit state to the point that one of our neighbors is going to swallow us up. They weren't sure which one. And what do we do to revitalize ourselves? And I think for many of them, Christianity was both a personal form of revitalization and also a way of revitalizing the nation. And by the way, Korean Christianity is still incredibly strong today. About 30% of Koreans identify as Christians, which is much higher than any other East Asian country.
Well, given this history, which they're very familiar with and we're ignorant of, how do most Koreans think of their relationship if, for example, the United States does depart? What do they feel confident that they can maintain their independence, their strength, their economic power, and but basically their independence with neighbors like China, Russia, and even Japan, which is, so far has, renounced and doesn't show any sign that aggressiveness that they demonstrated before, but I'm sure the Koreans would not accept any guarantees that it would continue.
Yeah, except for a few student radicals, I have never met a Korean who was excited about the swift departure of the United States. Okay, that's not anything that any of them would like to see. But the question is, the United States is 6,000 miles away, right? China, Japan, and Russia, they're right here. They're right here right now. So how do we deal with that over the long terms? And this is why the THAAD issue was so tricky for the Koreans to navigate, right? Because this is something that's putting them at odds with China over really American issues with North Korea. They don't want that. They want to find a way to keep the Americans in, but also hedge their bets so that they can have good relations with their neighbors going forward, except the Japanese. I actually think very few of them are in favor of good relations with the Japanese, which is very problematic. But yeah, so I think they really, the confidence is really not there if there was a sudden departure. And so I don't think anyone supports that at all. And I'm always shocked when I talk to my friends who are in the Korean military, because if you've been to North Korea, if you know something about the North Korean military, and if you know something about the South Korean military, I'm a civilian, but on paper it looks like no contest if you're actually talking about armies confronting each other in the field. Well, that is not the opinion I ever hear from Korean military officers. And when I ask them, what do you think of your odds are in, a shooting war with the North Koreans, all nuclear weapons and everything aside, and they say, with the Americans or without the Americans? And I say, without the Americans. And they say, well, and this lack of confidence I find really unnerving, because I think that there really should be no doubt, but there's something else going on there. I'm not exactly sure what it is. It could be a lack of combat experience for a couple of generations now after Vietnam, but and these are very informal conversations. This is the impression that I get.
We have time for another question. Well, if there are no others, then please join me once more in thanking Dr. Fields.
Thank you very much. Thank you.